might be wondering if Pocky and Rocky Reshrined is a brand new game, or a remake, a remaster, oh, a reboot. Actually no, none of the above. Despite initial appearances, Reshrined is a bona fide sequel that does the Super Nintendo games proud. It starts out looking like a complete makeover of the first Super NES game, with nearly identical opening levels, enemies, and locations that'll hit the nostalgia button for those that grew up playing it. Lovingly recreated with beautiful sprite work and animation to match the original. Stage 2 rolls around, and again, it's a near perfect recreation, at which point you're positive we've got a remake on our hands. But no, it's only the beginning, as after the first couple stages, Reshrined veers off and reveals itself to be a new game, with new characters, story, and stages. You'll still see some similar locales and enemies, but in general, the remaining game is packed with new layouts and bosses, along with some familiar areas, but a different storyline and cutscenes. Without ruining the plot, any familiar ground you see going forward isn't a remake, but part of the story. Think of it as a mix of the old and new. I highly recommend going back and enjoying the original game on the Super NES, because not only is it an excellent game in its own right, but you'll appreciate the sequel that much more. Heck, go ahead and play the next games in the series too. But Reshrined brings the series into the modern age, fixes the annoying quirks of the original, expands the lore and playable characters, and gives us yet another well-made 16-bit style blast to enjoy. Reshrined is Pocky and Rocky done right, so if you're a fan of the series, you'll be thrilled with the results. It's hard to imagine them making a more worthy follow-up, so let's take a look at what makes Reshrined a success. Pocky and Rocky was already a great looking game, and what I love about the visuals of Reshrined is how they found a way to make them even better for modern displays, while maintaining the pixel art look. It's exactly what was done with Androdunas 2 that I recently reviewed, and a perfect way to update a series while staying true to its visual roots and art design. Many new sequels, even if they're good games, modernize the graphics in a way that completely kills the nostalgia of the originals, but Reshrined gets it right and then some. Rustling trees with leaves blowing in the wind through stages. The mechanical wings of the airship cycling as the town on fire glows below. The trapped denizens of a castle crying for escape. Every stage is full of movement, and yet it still looks like it could be a Super Nintendo game. The more you play, the more you see what painstaking detail was taken to recreate stages and enemy animations. But it goes a step farther by adding new enemy types and obstacles along the way, and more stage hazards to overcome. Even when some bosses seem initially the same, they'll eventually evolve into a second, cooler phase the original didn't have. You come in expecting a recreation, but are constantly surprised by all the cool touches added everywhere. Another great addition is the new character variety. Not just Pocky and Rocky, but now 4 different characters you alternate throughout the story mode. They each bring their own flavor to the game, with my favorite Ikazuchi, an offensive glass cannon sporting, I kid you not, a damn Truxton laser as one of her weapons. Now I have to mention the other character, Ame no Ozume, has been causing some controversy, and may determine which version of the game you get. A Japanese goddess of Shinto folklore, her cleavage has been censored for the Western release. Now, I'm not a big fan of censorship, but I think everyone is missing something far worse that even plagued the originals. Rocky is not a raccoon, he's a tanuki. So where the hell is his giant lucky nutsack? Was he neutered? My PC Engine tanuki had him. Konami didn't slice the tenders off their tanuki in Parodius, so why did poor Rocky get a balsectomy? Forget the cleavage, I can get that on Pornhub. But where else, besides Japanese video games, can I get my fill of giant fuzz nuggets? But besides the Western censorship, there's absolutely nothing to nitpick here in terms of graphics and the work done. It's wonderfully detailed and all we could have hoped for, with plenty of stages and a pretty long game that takes around an hour to complete. The music remixes are also fantastic and would almost go unnoticed unless you're paying attention. Many of them are faithful to their original stages with the same great tunes, not messing with nostalgia. while the new levels now sport some of my favorite compositions in the series. Catchy, understated tracks that match the pacing of the game, and feel like they belong right next to the originals. There are so many sound effects going on in this game that, while really good, tend to overshadow the music, and I found that going into the options and turning down the effects a few notches to favor the music allowed me to really enjoy it that much more. The cutscenes and story are also expanded quite a bit for anyone who wants to enjoy the new plotline, yet it keeps it simple to match the style of the original, not going overboard just because they can. Everything about the presentation in Reshrined is first rate, and even if it doesn't end up being the best new retro revival we see this year, as there are some seriously hot contenders vying for the throne, it may win top honors for its visuals. It's hard to imagine them doing the series more justice. Of the entire Pocky and Rocky series, I always enjoyed the gameplay of the arcade original and the first Super NES game the most. It was faster paced, arcade-style action that rewarded good memo and resource management. The original did have its faults, with some pretty rough and unfair moments. But what good game worth its salt didn't during those 16-bit years? It was part of the package. No, Pocky and Rocky isn't really a shmup, but they were good run and guns you could fire up for a quick blast. And Reshrined mostly follows in those footsteps, taking the mechanics of the first games and improving them farther with added variety. It's not quite as fast-paced as the originals. Some areas more focused around camping out and taking out groups of difficult enemies before moving on, but still closer to the original in spirit versus the markedly different second game. You still have your three typical shots, blue, red, and green, which varies per character. All three are viable and powerful, along with your trusty purification rod for swiping away close range, which now also ricochets bullets back on enemies, making it even more useful. Starting on stage 3, your arsenal expands, adding both a charge and a quick shot special. For Sayo-chan, your charge creates an all-important defensive shield, and should be spammed as often as possible. It also doubles as an offensive weapon, creating some high DPS moments when needed. Instead of using auto-fire, quickly tapping the fire button now throws out mirrors, which reflect and enhance your main weapon while homing in on enemies, giving you some extra firepower and strategy to handle them, along with a limited bomb set that don't return after death. You've still got plenty of options, and different characters have different charge sets to discover. As I mentioned, my favorite being Ikazuchi, more of an advanced character as she takes damage more easily and doesn't have the defensive charge of others, but she makes up for it in raw DPS, doing big damage with any of her weapons and taking out some enemies and bosses before you can blink. Fragile when weak, but a bulldozer when fully powered with a red Truxton laser that targets enemies. Ikazuchi is just fun to use. The environmental hazards are more of a threat than the original. None overly complex, but simple maze-like areas that require some memo and strategy. But because Reshrined really doesn't rush you and allows you to take your time, without constantly respawning enemies, learning to get the 1cc isn't that stressful. You can take your time in most areas, and the extends are more generous, showing up in quick shops throughout the game and handing out randomized upgrades. I also really like the continue system, allowing you to practice each level as many times as you want when first playing through, but have to go back to the start of the level, or to your last checkpoint, depending how far you got. Health increasing as you progress, checkpoints, and endless continues. Pretty much anyone can slowly work their way through. It's not as difficult as the original on the Super NES, but it's also not a cakewalk the first time through, and a good challenge. And once you complete the game or earn enough coins, you unlock things like easy mode, free play using any character, and even a 5th character for hard mode, aside from having a stage select, which we never had back in the day with these console games, at least without a code. It's pretty much got most of the options you'd want, including online leaderboards to see how you're scoring versus others. It also performs well, testing at about 3.5 frames of delay on the Switch, meaning just over 4 frames including my display. Oh, and unlike Androdunas 2, which pulled out the 2-player mode from the original, Pocky and Rocky dare not do such a thing, given how important it was for the original games. So yes, you can play local co-op with a friend as well. well. Now, the gameplay isn't perfect, with the difficulty balance being off a bit throughout. Portions of the mid-game and some bosses are the most difficult, while some later game sections and bosses are on the easier side, along with a final boss that I won't spoil that's super cool and more of a spectacle, but quite easy to blow through. But it's also offset by removing some of the cheap and unfair moments of the original games. And once you've learned the game and are possibly playing on hard mode, you'll probably no longer think much of it one way or another. At the end of the day, the overall gameplay of Reshrined is top-notch, and absolutely worthy of the series. So in the end, there really isn't a single thing Pocky and Rocky Reshrined doesn't get right. The graphics are beyond what we could have hoped for in an already beautiful series of games. An example for other developers to follow in terms of revamping a classic franchise and maintaining the nostalgia. Just like Androdunas 2, it captures the spirit of the original game perfectly. The music, while not necessarily spectacular, didn't need to be, as neither were the originals. Instead, charming and catchy tunes that perfectly fit the game and pay homage to the first game without overtly calling attention to themselves. The stage music simply enhanced the experience and never detracted. And for me, turning down the effects really brought out the excellence of the new stages and music. The gameplay is spot on, a great combination of the original game feel, while also adding a ton of new elements. Do I like it more? Yes and no. Yes, in that it adds much more to the game and fixes some of the jank. And no, that in the process, it also slows down the pacing just a bit, making it less frantic and almost forcing you to slow down and take your time. But that's more of a personal preference than a knock, as it's completely legit game design and one many will appreciate, that don't try to Leroy Jenkins their way through levels like I do. But there's no denying that Reshrined is now the best looking, fantastic playing, varied game in the series, with many characters and options to enjoy. Shout out to Weeb Nerd Gaming for providing some alternate gameplay from his various 1cc's. And if you're looking for strategy, he has some very useful commentary. He's posted clears for every single game in the series, which you can see on his channel, and along with Androdunas 2, which I also reviewed recently and you can check out right here, is the kind of classic revival us old retro fans live for.